Now, after the fall of Israel, only Judah remained. The land that had belonged to Israel was partially ruled by Ammon, and Edom. The Edomites were to the east and so on, and that was the nation that eventually fell to the Babylonians. Now we're going to look at what happened from the time of the Babylonian captivity to the time of the building of the second temple, the rebuilding of the temple, because the temple was utterly destroyed by the invasion. Priests were deported, and all the royal houses went to Persia. And Yahwism received very strong Zoroastrian influence. For example, the story of creation. In Zoroastrian and Babylonian sources, in the Enuma Elish and other sources that are much older than Judaism, the story is told of the council of gods who gathered together. And from this council of gods, light emanated. And this council of gods proceeded to create all creation in a period of 7 days. And each of the 7 days is exactly the same as the 7 days of the Jewish creation. And the crown of that is the creation of the first human beings. And they're made by the sacrifice of the blood of a god who is killed by another god, etc. And so you can imagine what happened as the Jewish priests encountered this story. They had never, in the first place, they had never asked questions about the origin of things and the creation of things, and they had never understood very much about the stars and astrology and astronomy and so on. And so they would have said, well, you're right. At the very beginning, there was light, but it wasn't a council of gods. It was one God, but we call him Elohim in the plural. And from God spoke a word, and he said, let there be light. And fiat lux, and light appeared. And then he did this on the first day, and this on the second day, and this on the third day, just like you said, the 7 days. But the creation of man is not quite the way you said it was. The creation of man, God breathed a breath into people, not blood, but a breath, etc. So the creation story, the story in Genesis, is really fabricated by the priests, and it's the Jewish version of what the Zoroastrians were telling about the creation of the world. Many things were learned by Jewish priesthood and by Jewish people from the Babylonians. It was an advanced civilization, and there was much to learn. And that made an indelible stamp upon Judaism. And probably the most important things to mention that came from that were kind of an ethical dualism, the battle between light and darkness, which is actually a cosmic kind of battle, the idea of a satanic force, eventually it develops into that, the idea of angels, which was Zoroastrian, Babylonian originally, not something that you will find in the old books of the Old Testament, and the idea of the fall of the angels, and indeed the fall of man in general. Now, the Persian diaspora of the Jewish families led eventually to the codification of Jewish rules based on the books that they had put together for them that were the basis of their religion now that they no longer had a temple. And they created what was called the Babylonian Talmud. And that still exists, and it was the basis for what would later be a Palestinian Talmud and the beginning of the rabbinic writings in Judaism. Now, after a certain amount of time, after several generations of life in Persia and in Babylon, Ezra and Nehemiah gained the respect, and Jewish priests and Jewish religion were very highly respected by the Babylonians, and they gained permission to go back and recolonize Jerusalem for the sole purpose of rebuilding the temple, and but not to fortify it, not to fortify the walls and make it into a defensible city, because that would be too much like starting to start a new country again. So Ezra and Nehemiah took builders, Zerubbabel, and there had never been a tradition of Jewish masonry and architecture. So the Jews were trained in these traditions, the traditions of building and building a temple and stone building, stone masonry and so on, by the Babylonians, using the stone materials that were so readily available around Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel, who is cited in the New Testament in Matthew's Gospel as one of the forebears of Joseph, the father of Jesus, and would have therefore been one who carried forward the tradition of masonry, of stone masonry. Zerubbabel goes and teaches this to several families, and they construct the temple. This is what we call the Second Temple. The Second Temple was not all that great and big. It was eventually expanded and then finally built greatly by some of the Roman, the people who were beholden to the Romans, and eventually turned into a great monstrous thing, which we'll look at later. Now, one of the things that Ezra and Nehemiah did is they came into the native land, into the Amaharites, the people of the land who had not been taken in captivity. They were the Sumerians. And they came in with their reform and with their troops and with their rebuilding of the temple, and insisted that anyone who was going to be a member of this religion and what would eventually become this country must divorce their non-Jewish wives. So there was a wholesale great social upheaval at this time, and many of the Sumerians refused to do so, and so they were now kept as separate from Israel. They occupied more of the Galilean areas, and now there was a separation between the new Reformation of Israel and then the Sumerians, or the Samaritans. They rebuilt the temple, and after a while they broke their promises and they started to rebuild the fortifications, probably because they had to protect their work from marauding bandits and things like this. And eventually they declared independence and they reestablished Israel as a nation and went against what they had said they would do. And so from the time of the Babylonian captivity to the rebuilding of the temple, we have a whole process in which the Bible is created and the Jewish scriptures are created, and more of them are still being created. The book of Job is yet to be written and put together, the book of Daniel, and so on. And Israel is reestablished as a nation. Now, in the context of this history, we want to look at the power of the prophets. The prophets were essentially shamans. They were Jewish desert shamans. And the greatest of them was probably Elijah, Eliyahu Nabi, Elijah the prophet, greatest of the miracle-working prophets. In order to understand the things that are attributed to Jesus, we have to understand that they were prophetic powers that had been ascribed to Jewish prophets in the past. A Jewish prophet was a holy man who had dedicated his life to serving Yahweh. One of the powers that the prophets were considered to have was the power to raise the dead. We know the stories of Jesus raising the daughter of Jairus, or raising Lazarus. Well, what about the story of the prophet Elijah, who lies with his body parts upon the dead son of the widow of Nain, and he breathes pranic energy back into the body using shamanic techniques, and the son comes back to life. Now, the story of Elijah is a story not only of a power, but also of a technique of working with vital force and vital energy. Jesus, when he, according to legend, restored dead people to life, did so without laying upon them or anything. He did it by simply speaking forth, saying, "Stand up, rise, be alive again." This is a frieze depicting the raising of Lazarus from the grave. He's wrapped in his winding sheets, and Jesus is bringing him forth. Very, very important and very symbolic story to the Johannine tradition. Walking on water, well, we're told that Peter and the disciples were out on the sea, and a great wind came up and the waves overwhelmed them. And Jesus came to them walking on the water. And there's no question about it, even though the old liberal scholars wanted to say, well, he looked like he was walking on the water. He was walking para in Greek, the water. He's walking alongside the shore on the water. No. It's very clear the Greek says he's walking on top of the water. He's walking on the water. What do we know about that from prophetic history? We know the stories of Elijah and his chela, his closest disciple, to whom he passes his mantle, Elisha, walking through the Jordan, passing through the Jordan, walking, in one account it says walking upon the waters or walking through the waters, just as Moses had done and delivered the people of Israel through the Red Sea. So these are stories that we know are attributed to the prophets and the prophetic powers. There are many other stories that are part of prophetic mysticism and that may indeed have been part of the kinds of powers that were manifested by prophets. They used vital force. They had psychic powers to read people's minds. Angels ministered to them in the story of Elijah, where the ravens bring him food and so on. They had personal communion with Yahweh, personal communion. Here's a picture depicting the prophet Elijah running ahead of the chariots for many, many miles to bring news of an event to a king. Shamans, even though he's an old man, he's in his 70s or 80s, he can outrun the chariots and the horses. And one of the things that we find is characteristic in all shamanic traditions is a tremendous vitality of the older shamans, male or female. Here is a picture depicting some interaction between the prophet Elijah and the widow of Nain. However, we find the raven shown on the tree. That refers to the story of Elijah in the desert who has no food or drink, and he is provided for and kept alive by food brought to him by ravens. Now, we might think that's a wonderful story, but actually there are some interesting modern examples of just that happening. In Africa, a young boy fell into an elephant pit and had no food or drink for days, and ravens, big black birds, came up to him and brought him food and eventually led people to where he was. And this was in the newspapers in the middle 90s, the 1990s of the century. And there have been other stories of this sort of thing happening. Dolphins bringing people out of the sea and saving them from drowning and things like this. The relationships between prophets and animals, a very unusual and amazing kind of relationship, is something that is documented in many, many stories. We know the story of Elijah, who is in search of communion with God, and he goes up on the mountain, and there's great thunder and lightning, but the voice of God is not in the sound of the thunder or the lightning. And the wind blows very, very hard, but the voice of God is not on the wind. And finally, he finds the voice of God in a still, small voice in the silence. And this is the personal, deep communion that was had by the prophets with Godhead himself. Now, in the story of one of the great prophets, which is Elijah, but not in all the other, many other stories of the prophets, there is the story of the passing of his mantle onto his chief disciple. And as he was becoming very old, and of course in Elijah's case, he was said to have been assumed bodily into heaven, like Enoch. He didn't have to go through the process of dying and having his body decay. But it is thought and was said and believed that his mantle had magical powers, and that by passing the mantle from one to the other, one received those powers. It was not just a symbolical thing, it was an actual thing. Now, we know that many of the prophets were the founders of schools, prophetic schools. their writings or their prophecies were written down by their disciples, and they were passed on through many generations. I've talked about the school of Isaiah, which went on for many generations. There was also in the wisdom tradition a school of Job, in which the basic premise of the book of Job is taken up by ensuing generations, and new chapters and new solutions to the problem of Job are brought forth and in debate and so on. We know that the prophets and the holy men had those who studied with them and preserved their writings, or actually wrote their writings down and passed them on. Here we have Elisha and by the Jordan River, and Elijah is about to be assumed into heaven, and he passes on to him his mantle and is assumed into heaven. And that way all the other disciples, the other prophets in the desert, know that Elisha is to become their leader. In the case of Yeshua, the Master Jesus, he had many disciples, some who were inner circle disciples and many others who were that were not part of the what we call the inner circle. But the mantle of Jesus, which would be the seamless robe that is described in the narratives, is not passed on to one person. As a matter of fact, according to the legend, the seamless robe of Mar Yeshua is divided among Roman soldiers who gamble for it, and we don't know where it ended up. There's a wonderful movie called The Robe about it, but it doesn't. We haven't got this seamless garment. But the successors to Jesus, the Mebazrim, which in Greek we call the apostles, the messengers, had to earn their own mantles, so to speak. They, however, were empowered by Yeshua with many things, the 72 of them with the power of exorcism, the power over dark forces. And the inner circle apostles, according to the Johannine tradition of the Last Supper, are actually empowered with the Holy Spirit and the passing on of what we think of as apostolic succession when he breathes onto them. He breathes upon them and says, "Receive ye the Ruach HaKodesh." Now this is done and has been done ever since in the making of bishops. When we consecrate a bishop or a successor of the apostles, the consecrating bishop performs what's called an exsufflation. He blows upon the crown of the head. He breathes upon the crown of the head and says, "Receive ye the Holy Spirit and all the powers of a bishop," and so on. So while there was not a significant passing of the authority of Jesus to one particular apostle, we do know from early legends that probably his successor, and perhaps his dynastic successor, was James the Just, James the brother of Jesus. And that he was considered to be such a holy man that in Jerusalem it was insisted by the crowds of people that he himself would take the place of the high priest, go into the temple on the Day of Atonement, and go into the Holy of Holies and make the atonement for all Israel. And it was said he was such a holy man. He had great calluses on his knees from praying, and he was like a priest, and he was considered to be the greatest of the apostles in several of the traditions that we have very little remaining to us from, like the original Hebrew Gospel of the Hebrews and the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And in early other traditions, we find places where Jesus is saying, when this apostle asked, "To whom shall we go after you have left?" he says, "You shall go to James the Just, for whom heaven and earth was created," and so on. It's likely that was the true successor of Jesus, but successorships came through the other apostles as well, like Peter. Now we want to look at Yeshua as a master exorcist. Exorcism was a very important thing that developed later among the holy men and the skilled wise men of Israel. We're told that Jesus is driven by the Spirit out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights to be tested by Shaitan. Now Satan originally in the book of Job which is an older literature from several centuries back, before we find stories about the fall of man and so on and the fall of the angels, Shaitan is an angel, a prince in the court of God, and he has the job of being the accusing attorney. He is the person whose job is to make the case against somebody before God. He's not the defending attorney, he's the prosecuting attorney. He's later known as Diabolos, the one who makes the case against people, and even the slanderer. So here, supposedly, Yeshua confronts this great evil power, and the evil power promises him all kinds of things if he will just follow him and do all kinds of things, and Jesus overcomes all these testings. Unfortunately, we're used to the King James translation of testing as temptation. So we talk about the temptation of Jesus in the desert as though he's tempted to do things he shouldn't do or something like that. And as a matter of fact, it's even written that way in the Gospels. He's tempted. The Shaitan tempts him by saying, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll just do that. The interesting thing about that is that shows that this is a little bit later kind of Greek-based legend, not a story that Jesus would tell other people about himself or his personal experience. It's kind of like Moses telling the story of his death in Deuteronomy. That's really kind of impossible. If this story about the temptation in the desert, the 40 days and 40 nights, if there were any information from that would have had to come directly from Jesus. Jesus would have had to say, well, I could have ruled the world and I could have this, but I I would forego all these things in order to become the Messiah or something. But so it's very clear that the story of the temptation, quote, in the deserts is not really a historical description of something that Jesus did. That Jesus spent much time out in the desert in communion with God, and this sort of thing there is no doubt about, however. We are told, however, that Jesus was an exorcist. He was one who could call the evil spirits out of people and return them to their normal state. In fact, before Jesus in his ministry becomes a healer, before he heals people, the first thing he does is he casts out demons, and that's what happens at first with people. He comes upon people who are possessed by demons, and the demons flee from him. His method is very interesting when we study exorcism. It's a Jewish method. He will demand to know their names, and once he knows their names, he has power over the spirits, and then he tells them what to do, and they have to obey him. And he calls them out, but he doesn't have to use any magical seals of Solomon or herbs or recitations of psalms or anything else like the Jewish exorcist of his time would do. He would simply, by the force of his own development, he could command these spirits to leave. Now we need to look at the phenomenon of possession because it is documented in all cultures and societies. Probably the simplest and most available book to read on is the book by Osterreicher, which was used, in fact, by people when they made the movie The Exorcist. They used this as their basic manual. So, what's called demon possession or possession by evil spirits or whatever you want to call it is common to most cultures. It seems to occur especially at times when for women when they are beginning to menstruate, or for young people when they're coming into puberty and going through a lot of that kind of imbalance. And there are certain times that this manifestation comes along, and then it maybe never leaves them and becomes a problem for a long time. Some of the characteristics: they'll speak in foreign or strange tongues, not in actual real tongues of other countries or things, but there are documented cases where they do speak in other tongues. They have a Tourette's-like affinity for a lot of profanity and yelling, many self-destructive fits and acts, and they seem to have supernatural knowledge or phenomena. The phenomena might be like the poltergeist phenomena, where around them fires would break out or objects would fly from one place to another, and so on. The remedies that are used today for these conditions are psychodynamic, gestalt therapies and other kinds of things, psychoanalytical therapies like Freudian, psychoanalytical therapies like Freudian analysis, and just plain allopathic drugs that are used to control the brain and things like that. Now, possession and exorcism are phenomena that are known very well among shamans. For example, American Indian shamans. There are quite set rituals to go through for ridding people of possession, either the loss of the soul or the taking over and capturing of the soul by another entity, etc. How does it work? How does exorcism work? Well, possession of one person by another entity is considered to be a control. A mild case is possession that would come through the nape of the neck, and a strong case comes through the solar plexus, and the entity is in total control of the person. The person has no control over himself. And the possessing entity is an ego state, and it's interpreted at least as a separate entity. So there are often violent and self-destructive acts that are done by the person who is possessed. Very often mass murderers will claim to be directed by voices, and people who are homicidal or suicidal will be claimed to be having strong suggestions always being given to them in their brains by these voices. There was therapy that in ancient times that was, and there is still therapy, the same kind of thing that's being done in primitive tribes, that is very effective, that actually works and causes possession to cease. It consists of casting out of this evil spirit or ego state by the exorcist. The prerequisite is that the exorcist has to have really paid his dues. The exorcist has to be someone who really has more psychic force than the entity. And he is one who will have gained dark forces through individual effort, gained power over dark forces. And very often, all shamanic work is accomplished by the shaman, by a shamanic illness. And when the shaman is able to overcome the shamanic illness, he is then able to overcome negative forces and things like this. But if he is not able to overcome it, then he becomes dead or a very sick person. I like the analogy to a snake handler. If The exorcist is like a snake handler who gets bitten by the snakes, but he doesn't die, and eventually he develops an immunity to them, and he also develops a power over them, almost a hypnotic power, and is able to control them. And this is what an effective, powerful exorcist is in any ancient or primitive tribe. There are modern means of effective therapy. For example, psychotherapy for multiple personality. There's Gestalt therapies where you communicate with the entity or the ego state, and psychics who communicate with the entity to find out what it wants and tell it that it's a dead person and it needs to go on now, and etc. And this stuff works pretty well. There are ineffective ways of dealing with it, however, because the ancient church, after the time of Jesus, for about 100 years, gained its fame and its power through its ability to exorcise, to promote exorcism and healings. And then it lost that power about in the 2nd century. The church has maintained rites and rituals for exorcism. The Catholic Church and the Anglican Church have rites of exorcism that are essentially worse than useless. And why do I say they're worse than useless? Because sometimes they make situations much worse than they are. The powers of suggestion of having Catholic priests go to some kid who's, quote, possessed, actually intensify and auto-intensify the disease and make things even worse. Currently, at the Vatican, the person who is the head exorcist, the specialist in exorcism, I was told this several years ago, is just a broken human being. He's gone out and been brought out to work with various cases, and he has basically been turned into a destroyed man. So the Christian church methods of using rites and rituals and saying things in the name of Jesus and all this sort of thing just don't really seem to have the power that they used to have.
The saints of the 1st century in Christian churches were powerful exorcists, but this ability was lost by the middle of the 2nd century. Catholic Church exorcism is very weak and inefficient today. We're going to take a look at real exorcism in Africa. Here are 3 women who have been possessed of a spirit of a lion since their husband has died. And the village has called in then a woman who is an exorcist, a shamaness. She prepares herself through various kinds of exercises and puts herself into a trance where she allows herself to actually be possessed by the spirit of the lion that is possessing these women. And yet she is so powerful that she can handle that spirit, and she can walk in that possession and then go over to where the women are possessed, and she can work in trance to free them from this. She brings the whole village together. She gives them different tasks. She works with the women, and the women are eventually freed of their trance, and she brings them forward as free beings.
А сейчас сменим тему. Мы расскажем вам об изгнании дьявола. Противоборство Бога и дьявола сейчас так же актуально, как и во все времена. И как 1000 лет назад место сражения – это человеческие души. Люди, одержимые бесами, стремятся в церковь, чтобы пройти ритуал очищения. О современных экзорцистах в репортаже Юлия Гробовская.
Сельский храм. За несколько лет он стал одним из главных центров экзорцизма. Одержимые дьяволом съезжаются сюда каждую пятницу, и здесь их вычитывает приходской священник отец Василий. Однако одного визита часто недостаточно. Для полного исцеления нужны долгие месяцы и даже годы.
Живуть як скоти. По-собачому гавкають, по-котячому, що хочете. А як ж? Це в'яз, як нечиста сила орудує людьми. В храм не може зайти. Больний. Його ведуть, він тікає з храму, там що чудо, ловлять і доганяють, і мати гнуть, що хоче. І на його мати, на батюшка, він терпить.
Снимать на видео чин изгнания бесов обычно не разрешают. Но отец Василий убежден, что эти кадры могут спасти многих одержимых, которые еще не слышали об экзорцизме, а заодно убедить скептиков, что одержимость дьяволом – реальность. Это самые обычные проявления вселившихся демонов. Непроизвольные телодвижения, крики, рычание, паническая боязнь священных предметов. Несколько лет назад, потеряв жену, он собирался уходить в монастырь, но духовный наставник сказал: «В клетку всегда успеешь, иди спасать людей». С тех пор в помощи священник не отказывал никому.
С одной я, когда, значит, она приходила, они были дуже яростные, сразу до того матюкались, что ужасно. Некоторые люди даже на литургию, когда приходили они, то матюкались. Вот, а люди говорили: батюшка, если так будет, мы уйдем из церкви. Я говорю: детки, вы только поймите одно. А если бы с вами это случилось бы, и я бы сказал бы вам: выйдите из церкви, как вам нравилось потом или нет? Нет. Значит, мы должны терпеть, спасать их.
Сам видит духовно больных и очень много внимания уделяет духовно больным. И вычетку делает, и отдельно работает с ними. Сюда приезжаю специально на вычетку. Я приезжал сперва с женой, потому что я сам не мог ходить. А теперь уже я сам прихожу.
Вычетка длится несколько часов. Сначала к телу бесноватого экзорцист прикладывает крест. Потом общий молебен и окропление святой водой. Для священника это огромное напряжение, для одержимых тоже.
Рука моя розкошає, я тоді нічого не зможу зображати. Мені жена, да, поработати, як тебе достати. Подумати надо. Як тебе достати, розірвати гадюку.
Людмила Маймес снова собиралась умирать от рака. После операции ее здоровье только ухудшилось. Пришла на вычетку и оказалось, что она боится Святого Креста и святой воды. У экзорцистов это верный признак одержимости.
Я нічого не чувствую. Я лично нічого не чувствую. А беса хрест пече. І того він кричить. В основному, як батюшка прикладає сюди ось хрест. І тоді от сильно він кричить. Пече його і забере свій хрест вонючий. Їм в церкві все воняє. Все святе їм воняє. Бесам.
5 лет назад в ряды экзорцистов вступил и отец Петр, настоятель. За эти годы он определил саму сущность демонов.
Это разумные духовные существа, и нельзя их недооценивать. Бесов нельзя ни в коем случае недооценивать. Они знают все законы физики, химии, математики вместе взятых. Они знают тайны человеческой души. Тот человек заблуждается, когда думает, что это какой-то вымысел, как нам вот люди думают, представляя это в каких-то фильмах, сказках и так далее, как добрые бесы там или белые колдуньи начинают помогать там и так далее. Ничего не бывает белого. Бесплатный сыр только в мышеловке, понимаете?
Противники экзорцизма – это чаще всего врачи-психиатры. Профессор Московского научно-исследовательского института психиатрии Юрий Полищук считает, что в ходе так называемой отчитки совершается эмоциональное стрессовое воздействие. И, несомненно, если речь идет о больных психическими заболеваниями, то такого рода процедуры обостряют состояние психоза.
Уйдите, суки, блядь! Уйдите, я боюсь, не надо, блядь! Потерялась! Уйди! Я сказал, я ненавижу! Уйди, потерялась!
Но православные экзорцисты это тоже хорошо понимают. Психически больных отправляют прямиком к врачу.
Видно, когда человек психически болен, а когда человек действительно одержим духом нечистым. И здесь, конечно, нужен опыт и нужна практика, чтобы распознать таких людей. Потому что если человек психически болен, и его начинаешь там вычитывать, и начинаешь производить какие-либо манипуляции и так далее, и молитвы, то просто-напросто ты этого человека еще больше усугубляешь его положение. Потому что психические заболевания и одержимость духом нечистым – это немножко две разные вещи.
Впрочем, побывав в психиатрической клинике, отец Петр решил, что 80% пациентов должны посещать вычетки. Одного он даже вылечил от шизофрении. Заведующая отделением призналась, что не видела такого за все 40 лет работы. Юлия Гробовская, Владимир Хребтович, Евгений Сафронов. Аналитическая программа «Постскриптум».
Now let's take a look at what Jewish exorcism and healing was like at the time of Jesus. Jewish exorcists were very famed for their abilities. They were hired very often by wealthy Romans to deal with problems of health and of actual possession, or many other problems of seizures and things like this. They used the magic of Solomon, the magic attributed to Solomon, the great wisdom of Solomon, the Solomonic magic, which is actually Enochian magic that was developed from Babylonian and other sources, angel magic. And they used these techniques. Basically, they would find the name of the spirit, and when they had the name, they would drive it out by means of using God's name or Kabbalistic verses from the Old Testament in the name of the shield of Abraham and the rock of Jacob and so on, this sort of thing. And they would drive it out that way. Now, Jesus always forced the spirit in the accounts that we have in the New Testament to give its name, but he simply commanded it himself. He didn't use herbs, he didn't use any of the other kinds of things or demonstrations that other people did. And when he was done, he said, when the dark spirits or the evil spirits go out of a person, they go and wander as though they were in a desert. And then they can come back to that person later and bring 7 more spirits even worse than they are, and find the house swept and cleaned, and they will go ahead and take possession of it again. And the way that he dealt with that is by sealing those that he exorcised with the Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. So he had some very special techniques that he taught to his disciples. And we're told in the New Testament that at one point he trained 72 of them and sent them forth to go out and to gave them the power of exorcism and sent them out to preach the news of the kingdom of God. Now, the early Christians exorcised in the name of Jesus. And it was very effective. In fact, people who were not Christians used the name of Jesus to exorcise. But after about 100 years, that became ineffective, and it didn't seem to work anymore. Now, I want to read you from the Jewish writer Josephus, who describes a Jewish exorcist. Now, this is what he tells us in the Antiquities of the Jews, the 8th book and the 2nd chapter. He says, "Now the sagacity and wisdom which God had bestowed upon Solomon was so great that he exceeded the ancients, insomuch that he was in no way inferior to the Egyptians, who are said to have been beyond all men in understanding. Nay, indeed, it is evident that their sagacity was very much inferior to that of the kings." Here, Josephus is a great apologist for the greatness of the Jewish people in a period of time when they were beleaguered and in a very weak position, and so he writes as an apologist for the Jewish people. Now, he says, he also, Solomon, distinguished himself in wisdom above those who were most eminent among the Hebrews at that time for shrewdness. Those, I mean, were Ethan and Heman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. He also composed books of odes and songs, 1,005, of parables and similitudes, 3,000, for he spoke a parable upon every sort of tree, from the hyssop to the cedar, and in like matter, etc. So he tells how great he was. And God also enabled him to learn that skill which expels demons, which is a science useful and sanative to men. He composed such incantations also by which distempers are alleviated, and he left behind him the manner of using exorcisms by which they drive away demons so that they may never return. And this method of cure is a great force unto this day. Now he tells his own witnessing of Jewish exorcism. For I have seen a certain man of my own country, whose name was Eleazar, releasing people that were demoniacal in the presence of Vespasian, the emperor, and of his sons and his captains and the whole multitude of his soldiers. The manner of the cure was this. He put a ring that had a root of one of those sorts mentioned by Solomon to the nostrils of the demoniac, after which he drew out the demon through his nostrils, which is considered to be a breath, a spirit. And when the man fell down, immediately he adjured him and return into him no more, making still mention of Solomon and reciting the incantations which he composed. And when Eleazar would persuade and demonstrate to the spectators that he had such a power, he set a little way off a cup or basin full of water, and commanded the demon, as he went out of the man, to overturn it, and thereby to let the spectators know that he had left the man. And when this was done, the skill and wisdom of Solomon was shown very manifestly, for which reason it is that all men may know the vastness of Solomon's abilities, etc. So this is a means in which a Jewish wise man might take upon himself the task of exorcising one who was possessed. Now, there was also the matter of healing and means of healing. There were, of course, physicians. There were Greek physicians and Jewish physicians. But there were those who healed with the same means that were used by the prophets, that is, by vital force. The therapeutai were the hands-on healers who lived in the Egyptian desert. And they used methods like those ascribed to Jesus. For example, in the fourth gospel, Jesus cures blindness by mixing his own spittle, which is his own vital force, with a certain kind of clay. He applies it as a salve to the man's eyes, and the man regains his sight. Slowly. At first he says he sees men as trees walking, and so on. There was also the use of chrismating or chrismation. To chrismate was to put oil upon a person and use the oil to transmit the powers of divine blessing and of vital force. A chrismation is also what we get the word Christing from, to Christ someone, or a Christ is one who has been anointed with oil, and so on. So the use of chrismation continued, and you find it recommended in the New Testament when there is someone who is sick, let them be anointed with oil and pray over him, and so on. And there are also stories of what we call the Theos Aner, the God-man, the man who has the powers of heaven within him to use for purposes of healing and rectifying and returning people from a state of decline into a state of original blessedness. Now I'm going to read to you from the life of Apollonius of Tyana about an incident in which he brings forth an exorcism. And like Jesus, he doesn't have to use any kinds of special formulas or herbs or rings or anything. It's just by the force and power of his own shamanic depth and spirit. This is from Philostratus' Life of Apollonius, Book 4, verse 20. Now while he, Apollonius of Tyana, who is considered to be a great saint, he was the one who revived the ancient mysteries. He had gone to India and been in silence for 5 years and learned from the Brahmins, and had revived the Pythagorean school, and was a wandering itinerant like Jesus, who lived and had his ministry shortly after the time of Jesus, and is described in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, and you should read it sometime to get an idea of what another take on the kind of person Jesus would be might be like, the life of Apollonius. So It says, now while he, Apollonius, was discussing the question of libations, he was a teacher, there chanced to be present in his audience a young dandy who bore so evil a reputation for licentiousness that his conduct had once been the subject of coarse street corner songs. His name was Coursera, and he traced his pedigree to Alcinous the Phasian who entertained Odysseus. Apollonius then was talking about libations. Libations were sacrifices that were poured out to honor the gods, and was urging them not to drink out of a particular cup, but to reserve it for the gods without ever touching it or drinking out of it. But when he also urged them to have handles on the cup and to pour the libation over the handle, because that is the part of the cup at which men are least likely to drink, the youth burst out into loud and coarse laughter and quite drowned his voice. Then Apollonius looked up at him and said, "It is not yourself that perpetrates this insult, but the demon who drives you on without your knowing it." And in fact, the youth was, without knowing it, possessed by a devil, for he would laugh at things that no one else laughed at, and then he would fall to weeping for no reason at all, and he would talk and sing to himself. Now most people thought that it was the boisterous humor of youth which led him into such excesses, but he was really the mouthpiece of a devil, though it only seemed a drunken frolic in which on that occasion he was indulging. Now when Apollonius gazed on him, the ghost in him began to utter cries of fear and rage, such as one hears from people who are being branded or racked. And the ghost swore they would leave the young man alone and never take possession of any man again. But Apollonius addressed him with anger as a master might a shifty, rascally, and shameless slave, and so on, and he ordered him to quit the young man and show by a visible sign that he had done so. "I will throw down yonder statue," said the devil, and pointed to one of the images which was in the king's portico, for it was there that the scene took place. But when the statue began by moving gently, then fell down, it would defy anyone to describe the hubbub which arose thereat and the way they clapped their hands with wonder. But the young man rubbed his eyes as though he had just woke up, and he looked toward the rays of the sun and won the consideration of all who now had turned their attention to him, for he no longer showed himself licentious, nor did he stare madly about, but he had returned to his own self as thoroughly as if he had been treated with drugs. And he gave up his dainty dress and summery garments and the rest of his sybaritic way of life, and he fell in love with the austerity of philosophers and donned their cloak, and stripping off his old self, modeled his life in future upon that of Apollonius. So here is a story of exorcism that's very similar to the kind of exorcism done by Jesus, who simply commands. So let's take a look at how this is done. These in Aramaic, the word is not demon. That's a daimon is a Greek word, which actually at the time of Socrates meant a little god. It didn't mean an evil spirit. And later on, there were other words, but the name for a daimon, a little god, was that very much like the name in Hebrew for the things which possess people, which were called elilim, little gods. And it also means a nothing, a nothingness, a darkness. So it was thought that in some cases of possession were the control of the elemental klipot, which came from the breaking of the vessels and the initial creation of the universe by God. When God creates the 10 Sephirot, he has to make them communicate with each other. In order to do that, he has to shatter the vessels. It was still represented in the Jewish wedding ceremony when the people step upon wine glasses and break them, the shattering of the vessels to open up the communication between husband and wife and make them into a union. And God had to do that to make the universe work. And in so doing, the shards, the broken pieces of the vessels, so to speak, became dark forces, antithetical forces, forces of devolution that are always part of the universe. They are not evil, who is or an evil force that is equal to God, but rather negative forces that exist as surely as reaction exists for action. So, in some cases, people were simply possessed by the elemental klipot, by the dark forces of the universe, and they had to be cleaned from that. Sometimes there was a spirit of a person who had died who was an evil person, and that person should have, after 40 days, that person should have gone through the second death and left his nephesh behind. The nephesh was the personal self, that was the astral body that would eventually decay back into the elements from which it came, and then his higher nature, his neshama, and his higher spirit would ascend into another reality, and he would no longer have the personality that he was. But very often the nephishim lived on because the spirit of people were so attached to human things, and they were so evil, they had done so many evil things that they wanted to live on vicariously through other people, and they drew upon their vital forces and vital energies. And so it was an earthbound spirit of a dead evil person, and that ghost-like thing had to be taken away and released from its parasitic hold on the person from whom it drew vital force in order for it to keep its own existence going. And when it was released, it would go to sleep, and then the second death would be accomplished, and the nephesh would dissolve, and the possessing entity would also be released. Or sometimes it was something more powerful, a fallen angel or some other immortal being that was taking over and using the body of another human being. And that entity was very, very hard to get rid of, and only one who had very high spiritual authority could command this kind of a thing. So the method was to identify the possessing entity, to force it to give it its name, and there were names for lower forms of angels, there were names for human beings, there were names for even the klipot, and then to compel it to depart and to disconnect itself from the possessed entity. To this, Yeshua added a seal. He sealed them with the Ruach HaKodesh. He sealed them with the Holy Spirit so that they could no longer be possessed. They would no longer be vulnerable to this kind of possession. So he did this by the force of his own very accomplished personality. I've said often, if you look at some of the tankas of the great Tibetan masters, you will find them not only in the form of their physical body, but you will find other forms of them, one of them being their terrifying nature, their terrifying self. And these are usually the same person, but the saint now looks like an avenging demon with fire and flame all around him. And that's probably what Jesus was like at some level. He probably had that kind of power around him, and he was just the biggest one on the block and could deal with anything that came along, just as all the great saints and shamans could do who were great exorcists. So the angels, the hierarchy of angels, really came into Judaism through its contact with Babylonian, Zoroastrian, Mazdaism, and so on. And names like Beelzebub and the other kind of things were Chaldean. They were Babylonian evil archons. And it may be that many of the fallen angels or the bad angels or the ones that were supposed to be the possessing angels or the legions of Satanel and so on, or the legions of the devil or of Satan, are actually foreign gods and who are understood as being evil rather than as being good. For example, Behemoth may very well come from Ganesha, the divine god of the Indians. Samael may be a version of the god Pan. And I'm showing you medieval drawings that show you their characteristics, and indeed you will find many relationships to these. Asmodeus is a God who has the same kind of countenance that you will find in some of the very sacred images of the East. And even later in medieval periods, Mercurius, which was an alchemical deity, was considered to be one who could also possess, and so on. So these entities that were populated from the world of the fallen angels and the whole angelology and demonology were really kind of all from the same population. Whether they were real angels or fallen angels, they were the same beings who had the same powers, and they were probably understood that way. What are the prophetic powers? The powers of the prophets that Jesus exemplify. Psychokinesis, mind over matter as we call it. Ability to actually change physical reality. Stories that are told about Madame Blavatsky, stories that are told about many of the masters and the shamans of the East. To walk on water, feed 5,000 people with a very small amount of food, to change water into wine. All these things are psychokinetic powers that we have also described in earlier prophets. To know the future, to prophesy the future. It's very clear that Jesus did prophesy the destruction of the temple, and it did come to pass, and because his followers knew of the upcoming siege of Jerusalem, they were able to leave before it happened and not be affected by it. It's very clear that he used healing, and he used vital force and vital energy. When the woman with an issue of blood simply comes up close enough to touch him, he felt a power going out of his body, and he told her that her fidelity, her faithfulness had made her whole. Laying on of hands is a use of vital force and vital energy that can be potentiated with olive oil, which was considered to be the powerful amplifier of divine energies, and so on. His mind-reading faculties, his psychic faculties, knowing what was in the mind of his Pharisaic accusers, he turned to them and answered their questions before they were even spoken, and this sort of thing. These are things that we see also represented in other cultures, both shamanic and sainthood traditions, and in the traditions of the Jewish prophets. And the resurrection and after-death appearances are part of a Jewish tradition. We never found the body of Jesus. Jesus did not, his body was no longer upon earth. His bones were not found. All that was left behind was a shroud and also a headband. And we do think there is good evidence to believe that we actually possess those historical articles. And his resurrection, which was known and understood in his form of Jewish mysticism as a kema, very different than the Christian idea of resurrection. And his after-death appearances are part of a tradition of mysticism that we're going to learn more about and understand more about as we deal with the sayings and teachings of Jesus. But these traditions are traditions that were also associated with the prophets, like Enoch and Elijah, who ascended into heaven bodily and did not leave a trace behind. So we have to understand that the miracles of Jesus, transforming water into wine, the feeding of the 5,000, the talking to the Samaritan woman at the well and telling her how many husbands she had already had, and all the psychic thing and all this. These are Jewish prophetic signs that were understood as such by the original followers of Jesus, but not at all understood by the Gentile churches. They were understood in an entirely different way as miracles. And the writers of John's Gospel, who still are in touch with Jewish tradition, try to correct that. They call them semea, signs. They are signs, not just as allegories, but they're divine signs that are to be understood in that way. So all these miracles, the miracles of healing, curing the lepers, exorcism, even the greatest of all miracles, the Chema, are understood in the context of Jewish prophetic mysticism. So we know of miraculous so-called powers exhibited by yogis and Hindu saints and shamans, and including things like resuscitation from death, such things as Yogananda's body not decaying, or the bodies of saints simply not going through any process of decay for long, long periods of time and exhibiting beautiful fragrances. We know many, many other things about these traditions in other religions and other traditions, and many of them are verified by first-hand accounts. So Jesus was a person who showed us what human beings could be. He showed us the human potential that is in every one of us, because we are all children of God. And he showed us what that meant, and he demonstrated those things to us. So he was skilled in healing, the use of psychic forces, exorcism, Merkaba, mysticism, heavenly ascent, and other Jewish prophetic and mystical techniques. And we must understand, when we study the Master Jesus and what his teachings were, exactly what the context was. And we have to understand that he was a master, not just of scripture, and not just of Judaism or proto-rabbinic Judaism, but he was a very advanced master who came to us through the means of Judaism, but was a world master who showed forth the great powers of all the great world masters, but perhaps way more greatly than any of them. This is the end of this module.